Hey guys, how's it going? And welcome back to Europe in Detail. And let's just take a minute here guys to have a look at what we've built so far. This is really nice. I didn't think that City Skylines could go anywhere near this direction whatsoever, but with the mods available and, a bit of creativity, look at this. This is just gorgeous. And now I'm getting some really good comments through from you guys. I can't wait to sprinkle some community knowledge into the project as well. So we build lots of things in this episode, but I guess the main focus is the old town square. But we start by building a tunnel and putting some terraforming over it with procedural objects, and the idea sort of evolves from there, and I'll talk about how and why it evolves as we sort of go along with the episode. So no mucking around, no wasting time, let's get into the building. The very first thing I do is I modify this stone bridge so that it's just got one side as a pillar and the other side sort of floating, and this doesn't really make much sense with what I end up doing, but originally I wanted to leave one side open and make the pillars look old and a bit more decayed, and have it so that it's right next to the seaside and you can actually see the rocks on the sea as you drive through the tunnel in places. So you'll see me sort of build towards that in the next little while, and I start by using Grey Flame's mossy rocks, and again I've made the grass colour a very similar colour to his rocks so that they sort of blend in, and I'm using those to make it look like it goes over the top of the tunnel. And the reason I do this is because I want to be able to look down the road and through the tunnel, and it's very difficult to do that with normal terrain, because as you guys would know, when we make a tunnel in game, the tunnels aren't rendered, they just go black. We can't look into them, it only goes in a little wee way. I want to be able to see cars going right through this in one side and out the other. And to be honest, I've pretty much taken on the challenge of doing this. I've never done anything like this in the game, and I kind of like the idea of doing a custom one. So in terms of design, what I've done here is I've tried to sort of leave it open and just use these truss arches, as sort of spaces to keep the terrain from dropping, and most of it's sort of rock that it's gone through, so we don't have to worry about too much falling debris inside the tunnel. And the next thing to do is carry on the mossy rocks right over the top of it and down and into the sea, so that it looks like the terrain's sort of spilling out and over the top of the tunnel. And then you'll see me whack a whole lot of trees over the top of it, and I've had to use prop trees here because I'm going on to a PO'd object. Pro and prop tree snapping does not work. Whew, that was a bit of a tongue twister. It doesn't work, you have to use prop trees, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. So now that you've seen me put all those trees in, you'll see me take them all back out again. I've decided that, I've had a bit of an epiphany or a bit of a vision, and I tend to follow these. So yeah, out come the trees, and we're going to actually build the city out over top of this tunnel. And I guess the reason I had this vision was because maybe this was a trade route or something of the like back in the day, and this sort of tunnel, maybe it's evolved over time, but maybe originally it was quite valuable, having control of this tunnel and this trade route. Being above this, gives a really good point for, for defending or attacking or whatever it is they're trying to do. But a lot of what you see me build on top of this, for one, is procedural objects, and two, there's a lot of old and sort of medieval buildings. I feel like this area could have been where the town had started from, either from what I just explained earlier, or maybe originally the town was set up for the construction of the tunnel, and originally the town was made up of the workers. Maybe, I don't know, it sounds plausible, and it really just gives me a good excuse to build something out of the ordinary and pretty darn cool, to be honest. It looks fantastic when it's finished. So at this point only the buildings are in, and all of them are PO, because we can't use actual buildings because they connect to the ground via terrain, and the tunnel part of it just obviously wouldn't work. So in other words, a lot of this down here is for show, but I'm not too worried about that. It's only going to be a small part of the city in the long run. And a lot of these old towns or old unique towns have something quirky about them. They're either built on the side of a cliff, or it may be built around an ancient site. And even outside of Europe, there's quirky cities built in unusual places, and I just see this as a bit of an extension of that. So, with all that in mind, what are some of the things that I should be looking out to build here? And two things stand out straight away that I probably should focus on, and one of them is making this obviously the oldest part of the city, or as aged as I possibly can. And number two, admittedly was probably more a detail thing than anything else, was just to make it look like it was eroded somewhat up here. I put in a few props here and there to make it look like the cliff has been sort of blown down over the years with wind and all the rest of it. There's a few ruins in here from maybe one of the world wars, which I think would make a lot of sense, because if this has been a trade route most of its life, and quite an important one at that, then it's more than likely morphed into being quite an important road, and during the world wars it was probably more than likely targeted. So I'm also, doing my best to make sure I upload some areas that are, bearing the cost of that war. So it's also worth noting, in case you haven't sort of guessed already, that we are drifting away from the actual Gotstatt here. This is sort of more my creation. But if this little town is seriously, over 1,000 years old, then there has to be, it's seen some stuff. So there has to be some form of realism to it in order for it to have lasted as long as it has, and there's definitely a good chance that part of it has been blown up or is in ruins. If not from war, then, from environmental disasters and such. And the town square that we move on to here is a perfect example. I've left most of this, or all of it, to be honest, intact, because it's such a small courtyard or town centre in respect to what we might build in future, that this particular one has survived all the wars that it may have seen and everything else that may have been chucked at its way. It's only about 15 metres across the courtyard, which is, considered a small town centre. But when you think about when this was built, or when it may have been appropriate for it to have been placed there, then there really wouldn't have been much need for it to be massive. This has always been a small village, and it remains a somewhat small village to this day. So you can see in the background here our little power line that we made in the last episode coming off our windmill, and this was all planned, obviously. When that windmill was made, or the town required power, when it was available or whatever, then the first place it would have been supplied to would have been the centre of town, which is exactly where we've got this power line running down to. So this all works out pretty well. I put a church, which is super appropriate, right next to the power line. That would have been one of the first things made in the city without a doubt. So off the back of the little square here, I put some stairs in and make an actual walkway that's going to run up the road here. We're going to detail that in another episode. And the rest of the square here is pretty much centered around the church, and there's a small fountain that I put in here in the middle. Apart from that, that's pretty much it. We go into a bit of detailing later on, but you'll see when we get there. And I'm really pleased with this. Like I touched on earlier, I'm hoping to put heaps more sort of town squares or plazas in the city, but this very first one had to be quite unique, and I think it needed to be quite simple and to the point, also with the church and the basic necessities that they may have needed back then. But of course, because the city is set in today's age, this has been upgraded somewhat, and now you'll see cafes and sushi bars and even a couple of brothels in there, because I know some of you are after those, you dirty buggers. But check it out anyway, guys. We're at my favourite part, the detailing, and we go to town around this little square. I want to make this an area that's flooded with people later on, but at the same time there's parts of it that are still aged. You'll see grass creeping through the cobblestones over in the corners where no one goes, and maybe there's a really narrow back alley somewhere with a really neat little restaurant down it that's a bit of a hidden secret. Imagine yourself just sitting out on one of these little tables looking out at all of this history and just taking it all in. Isn't that absolutely magnificent? It's fair to say I felt so passionate about nailing this town centre and getting it just right. And I apologise if I'm calling things the wrong things. Like I've mentioned before, I am just a humble Kiwi, but I really tried hard with this and I was so passionate about it. I hope you guys can feel that and get it and are inspired and all the rest of it. So the rest of the detailing you see here involves pretty much just awnings, and I chuck a couple of doors in where they're appropriate. And I put a little wee gap between these two buildings here so I could create this alleyway, and I want to make it look like an area where you want to go down there. You look down there and there's a little bit happening and you want to go down and have a look, and I think I've achieved that just with a couple of props, which is really cool. I was tossing up whether to use like actual brands in the city or not, and I've decided, bugger it, you know, at the odd Carlsberg sort of umbrella here and there or Heineken fence isn't going to hurt anyone. In fact, I actually need to start transitioning the city somewhat into the present day, and that's because I've got some big plans for some ancient / modern buildings, if that makes any sense, that I'm going to put in future. But that is pretty much it for that town centre or that plaza, whatever you want to call it. And next we move on to a little bit more detailing on what we created earlier. But of course not without putting down our pedestrian paths that we turn invisible eventually, and a few entertainment cube services hidden in the shops to bring some people in. Now I'm going to admit I wasn't that inspired to detail this area, just knowing that it's only for show. There's not really going to be that many people down here, and it's difficult to draw them down here with pedestrian paths because they really just have to loop down here and go back up. Not a lot of citizens are going to choose to do that because it doesn't make a lot of sense, and I knew all of this going into the detailing, so I still had to detail it though to keep it in line with the rest of the city, and eventually it was quite enjoyable. There's nothing too standoutish about any of the detailing here in this part. It's just pretty 101. The number one priority is making sure that areas are accessible and make sense, and number two is giving them some sort of detail. And admittedly, it's not as much here as I would normally do, but it's still something and it still looks pretty good. Look at that humongous cliff. I was so convinced all I was going to be able to do was cover this with trees, and I did that for a little while, and then I thought, you know what, bugger that, I am going to try and put buildings up this incline, and this is about as steep as you can possibly get. So my number one goal here was to make this all covered in buildings, make sure that you could see no terrain or very minimal terrain, and I wanted to make sure there was some form of pedestrian path, a usable, functional pedestrian path running up here, which was a tall order. Look how steep this is. So everything that you see me build here is shaped around what we need, which is that pedestrian path and covering this entire thing with buildings. So because the pedestrian path is functional, that goes in first. We get that in position, or rather we set all of the stairs in position. My apologies to anyone that may be disabled. And then we run the rest of the build around that. And just from a detailing point of view, one of the more difficult things to do is put handrails on staircases. And maybe I've missed a trick and I haven't seen something that's readily available on the workshop, but I've always found it very difficult to find the appropriate prop to make handrails. So I drag out networks, but sometimes they go a little bit wonky. It's hard to manipulate props, you know, even with PO it can be quite difficult. So I've never really found a go-to for handrails. If somebody ever made a stair set that came with a really nice old stone handrail attached to it, that would be so handy. Remembering that if someone doesn't want the handrail, they can just customize it with PO. Boom. instant front page on Steam. Exclaimer, no guarantees. I found it really hard for one reason or another to envision each individual area here because it was so diverse, there was so much to go on. I sort of just put one part in and then tried to come up with the next plan and then so on and so on. Once I got the main buildings in and I used all the blocks, which you guys that follow the series know what that's all about, then I could start putting in some of these sort of finer details. And one thing I love about this area in particular is because it's on such a steep incline, every part of it is really visible. So I've made it as beautiful as I can. It's super visible. And I've got to quickly say, look at that cool picture on the side of that building that you could see. I'm not sure who the building's by. I was supposed to remember. I'm so sorry guys, but look at that. It's so beautiful. I've purposely left that facing the city with nothing in front of it. You can't see it now, but we will see heaps more of it later on. So the next thing I do is I put some restaurants and some shops inside this building that we put in earlier, and how cool does this look when it's done? I put some pedestrian paths in here as well to have people walking in the appropriate places, but this looks so cool with these arches in front of it. And later on I go through and put some vines and trees and stuff like that around it as well. But my god, I have to say I am in love with how this looks. I'm so stoked with how this little part here comes out. So I try and top this area here off with one of the most amazing old decals I've ever seen in my life, and I've had this in my workshop for years but I've never found it because it's got no thumbnail, believe it or not. But it's so good, I decided to use it across all the levels in this little build here to sort of make it look like it was constructed at the same time. And then I tackle the most difficult part of this build by far, was putting the pedestrian paths in. And I've really got to try and think of this in future before I start to build. But after a bit of jiggling around, we get it sorted. And it just fills my heart with loveliness to see people walking up and down this creation when it's finished. So what do you guys think about what we've done here? I think my only other alternative was to slap a whole lot of trees around really, so I'm pretty stoked with how this has come out. It's a unique way to use a really steep cliff. Hope you guys really enjoyed that episode. I loved putting that together. If you're new around these parts, hit that subscribe button if you want some more, and I'd appreciate it if you guys hit that thumbs up as well. So take it easy guys, and I'll see you on the next episode. See ya!